This is a story about what happens when the people who create the most beautiful harmony together are the same ones who cause each other the most profound pain. This is the story of one such family, the Glaser Brothers, a trio of boys from the windswept plains of Nebraska who chased a dream all the way to Nashville and for a time caught it. Their voices, when woven together, created a sound so pure and sophisticated that it helped define an era of country music. They became Grammy-winning stars, trusted session singers for legends, and respected members of the Grand Ole Opry. But their story runs much deeper than their polished hits. They would go on to build an empire at the very heart of Music Row, a rebellious sanctuary that would become the cradle of the outlaw movement, fundamentally altering the course of country music. Their studio would be a clubhouse for Waylon Jennings, Willie Nelson, and a generation of artists who refused to play by the rules. Yet, within this revolutionary success, the seeds of their own destruction were sown. The bond forged in a small-town Nebraska home would ultimately shatter under the immense pressure of fame, fortune, and the clashing ambitions of three very different men. At the center of this epic, often tragic tale was the youngest brother, James William Glaser. Jim was the quiet one, the steady hand, the smooth tenor voice that so often anchored their intricate harmonies, while his older brothers, Tom Paul, the fiery visionary, and Chuck, the pragmatic businessman, commanded the spotlight and drove the narrative. Jim's journey was a more subtle, yet arguably more profound search for his own voice amidst the beautiful noise and the deafening silence of his family's rise and fall. This is his story, a look past the legends and the headlines, into the heart of a man who had to lose his brothers to finally find himself. To truly understand Jim Glaser and the music he was born to make, one must first understand the world that shaped him, a world of vast open spaces and tightly knit communities. Spalding, Nebraska in the 1930s and 40s was a place carved out of the immense humbling landscape of the American Great Plains. It was a small farming town where life was dictated not by clocks and calendars, but by the rhythm of the seasons, the spring planting, the summer sun, and the autumn harvest. The memory of the Dust Bowl was still fresh, a haunting reminder of nature's power and humanity's fragility, and it had instilled in the people a deep sense of resilience, pragmatism, and reliance on one another. Entertainment wasn't a passive commodity, it was a communal activity, a necessary release from the toil of the land. It was the Saturday night barn dance, the Sunday morning church choir, the impromptu jam session after a long day's work. Into this world, the Glaser household fit perfectly. The family home was an oasis of music. The father, Lewis, was a skilled country fiddler, his bow dancing across the strings with the tunes that had been passed down through generations. The mother, Marie, grounded the melodies with a steady hand on the piano. Music wasn't just a pastime in their home. It was a language, a constant presence that filled the rooms and bound the family together. For their three sons, this environment was their first and most important conservatory. Tom Paul, the eldest, born in 1933, was the natural leader. He was bold, charismatic, and possessed a restless creative energy that couldn't be contained by the Nebraska horizon. He was the protector, the one who pushed his younger brothers, the one who first dreamed of a life beyond the farm. Then came Chuck, born in 1936. He was the rock, the practical mind who could see the structure beneath the melody. Even from a young age, he possessed a keen sense of how things worked, a trait that would later make him the business architect of the family's empire. And finally, in 1937 came James, or Jim. As the youngest, he was the observer. He was quiet and sensitive, with a gentle nature that stood in contrast to his more forceful, older brothers. He watched them, learned from them, and found his place in the middle of their dynamic. Their musical education began almost as soon as they could talk. They didn't learn harmony from a book. They absorbed it from the air around them. They would gather around the piano, their mother guiding them, and learn to find their notes, to listen to one another, and to blend their distinct voices into a single, unified chord. Tom Paul's rugged baritone provided the foundation, Chuck's clear voice filled the middle, and Jim's smooth, high tenor soared over the top. The sound they made was extraordinary, a vocal blend that seemed to possess an almost preternatural perfection. It was the sound of shared blood, shared experience, and a shared love for the simple, honest beauty of a country song. Soon, their living room performances gave way to public appearances. Billed as the Glaser Brothers Trio, they became local sensations. They played at county fairs, town festivals, church socials, and on local radio programs. In a community that valued authenticity and hard work, the three handsome, talented sons of Louis and Marie Glaser were a source of immense local pride. For the brothers themselves, these early performances were more than just a hobby. They were a glimpse of a possible future, a future where they could make a living doing the one thing that felt as natural as breathing. The applause they received was intoxicating, a confirmation that the magic they created together was real and powerful. The dream of Nashville, once a distant, shimmering fantasy whispered about on the radio, began to feel like a tangible destination. It was Tom Paul who pushed for it, Chuck who likely planned for it, and Jim who, with his characteristic quiet resolve, prepared for it. The decision to leave Spalding was monumental. It meant leaving behind the only life they had ever known, the security of family, the familiarity of the land, the comfort of their community, for the uncertain promise of a city hundreds of miles away. It was a leap of faith, a gamble on their own talent, and a pact between three brothers to conquer the world together. When the Glaser brothers arrived in Nashville in the late 1950s, the city was crackling with an energy that was both exciting and intimidating. It was a stark contrast to the quiet, predictable rhythms of Spalding. Music Row was a bustling hub of commerce and creativity, a blur of publishing houses, record labels, and recording studios where fortunes were made and dreams were broken every single day. The air itself seemed to hum with ambition. The legendary Ryman Auditorium, the mother church of country music, stood as a hallowed institution, its stage the ultimate goal for every aspiring singer in town. The dominant sound of the era was the Nashville sound, a polished, pop-infused style developed by producers like Chet Atkins and Owen Bradley. They had smoothed out the rough edges of traditional honky-tonk music, adding lush string arrangements, smooth background vocals, and a radio-friendly sheen that was selling records by the millions. For three young men from rural Nebraska, it was a whole new world, and the Nashville system was a formidable machine to break into. They were outsiders, with a unique harmony but no connections. They did what countless hopefuls before them had done. They hustled. They played in any club that would book them, often for little more than tips and beer. They attended songwriter nights, networked, and knocked on every door they could, trying to get someone, anyone, to listen. The initial days were filled with the kind of struggle that tests the mettle of any artist. But the Glazers had two things going for them: an unshakable belief in their own talent and each other. Their brotherly bond, forged in the crucible of their isolated upbringing, was their greatest asset. Their big break came not from a record executive, but from one of the biggest stars in country music, Marty Robbins. Robbins was at the zenith of his career, a charismatic performer with an incredible ear for talent. Somehow he heard the Glazers sing, and he was immediately captivated by the precision and emotional power of their harmony. He recognized that their vocal blend was something special, a secret weapon that could add a new dimension to his own records. He hired them on the spot, not as a featured act, but as his personal backup singers and opening act for his roadshow. For the brothers, it was the opportunity of a lifetime. Suddenly, they were no longer outsiders looking in. They were on the inside, learning from a master. Touring with Marty Robbins was an education unlike any other. They learned about phrasing, stage presence, and how to connect with an audience. More importantly, they got to work in Nashville's top recording studios. This was where the real magic happened. They stood on the studio floor at the legendary Bradley Film and Recording Studios, a place where icons were made, and contributed to one of the most enduring songs in music history, Robbins' 1959 masterpiece, El Paso. Their haunting, ethereal oohs and ahs became an integral part of the song's dramatic cinematic landscape. They weren't just singing backup. They were helping to create an atmosphere, their voices painting a backdrop for Robbins' tragic tale. The success of El Paso turned the Glaser Brothers into Nashville's most sought-after harmony group. The phone began to ring off the hook. If a star needed a flawless vocal blend to elevate their record, the Glazers were the first call. They soon found themselves in the studio with a staggering list of future legends. They sang with Johnny Cash, their disciplined harmonies providing a perfect counterpoint to his raw, rebellious growl. They backed the incomparable Patsy Cline, their voices adding a layer of sophisticated sweetness to her powerful torch songs. They worked with George Jones, Tammy Wynette, and many more. This period was their university. Every session was a lesson in songwriting from the greats, a masterclass in production from the architects of the Nashville sound. They watched, they listened, and they absorbed everything. Jim, in particular, thrived in this environment, while Tom Paul was the restless networker and Chuck was the savvy negotiator. Jim was the quiet student of the craft. He paid close attention to the intricate details of vocal arrangements, the subtle art of microphone placement, the way a producer could shape a song's emotional arc. He was developing his ear, refining his instincts, and building a foundation of musical and technical knowledge that would serve him for the rest of his life. He was learning how to make records, not just sing on them. After several years of being the secret ingredient on countless other artists' hits, the time had finally come for the brothers to step into the spotlight themselves. Having paid their dues and earned the respect of the industry, they signed a recording contract with MGM Records in 1966. The challenge now was to transition from being the best backup singers in town to being a successful headline act in their own right. They needed to establish their own identity and their own sound. Their early records were a testament to everything they had learned. The production was immaculate, and the songwriting was top-notch. But the undeniable star of the show was their harmony. It was a sound that was both classic and contemporary. It had the heartfelt soul of traditional country music, but it also incorporated the sophisticated phrasing of jazz vocal groups, like the Four Freshmen and the pop sensibilities of the Everly Brothers. Their first major hit, 1966's Gone Girl, was a perfect showcase. Jim's clear, emotive tenor took the lead, telling the story with a straightforward sincerity, while Tom Paul and Chuck created a swirling, complex vocal arrangement around him. It was a sound that was instantly recognizable and utterly captivating. Their success grew steadily. They released a string of popular albums and charting singles. They became regulars on television shows, and in a crowning achievement, They were inducted as members of the Grand Ole Opry in 1965. For three boys from Spalding, Nebraska, standing in the hallowed circle on the Ryman stage was the ultimate validation. It was the realization of a dream that had once seemed impossible. They had officially arrived. They were respected, successful, and by all outside appearances, a perfect symbol of family unity and musical excellence. They had mastered the Nashville system, playing by its rules and winning the game. But beneath the surface of their polished, harmonious public image, a restless, rebellious spirit was beginning to stir, a spirit that would soon lead them to challenge the very system they had conquered, and in the process, change the course of country music forever. Having conquered Nashville on its own terms, the Glaser Brothers stood as a testament to the power of talent and tradition. They were mainstays of the Grand Ole Opry, their voices gracing hit records, their names synonymous with musical perfection. Yet for artists who valued creative freedom, mastering the game was not the same as winning it. The very system that had elevated them was beginning to feel like a gilded cage, its rules and formulas stifling the innovative spirit that lay beneath their polished harmonies. This growing restlessness, championed by the fiercely independent Tom Paul, would not lead to a quiet departure, but to an audacious act of rebellion. They would not just leave the Nashville machine, they would build a new one in their own image, a creative sanctuary that would challenge the establishment and forever alter the sound of Music City. By the late 1960s, the Glaser Brothers were pillars of the Nashville establishment, with multiple Grammy nominations and a place at the Grand Ole Opry. They had mastered the polished Nashville sound, but for the eldest brother, Tom Paul, this success felt like a creative prison. He grew disillusioned with Music Row's factory-like system, where producers like Chet Atkins held total control, and artists had little room for experimentation. This frustration was shared by a new breed of singer-songwriters, like Waylon Jennings, Willie Nelson, and Chris Christopherson, who felt stifled by the rigid industry. Sharing their rebellious spirit, Tom Paul envisioned a sanctuary free from these constraints, leading the brothers to make an audacious career move. In 1969, they invested their earnings into a brick house at 916 19th Avenue South, just a block from the corporate offices of Music Row. This act of defiance was transformed into a state-of-the-art recording studio they named Glaser Sound Studios, but it quickly became known as Hillbilly Central. The new venture perfectly showcased each brother's strengths. Chuck, the pragmatist, built a powerhouse publishing company that funded the enterprise. Tom Paul, the fiery visionary, became the studio's creative guru, fostering an atmosphere of complete artistic freedom. Meanwhile, Jim, the quietest brother, established himself as the master craftsman. Less interested in the chaos of the party scene, he focused on the technical and musical details. His most significant contribution was developing and manufacturing the renowned Glaser B bender. While the original concept for a B bender was pioneered by Gene Parsons and Clarence White, Jim's innovative mechanical design became highly sought after, allowing guitar players to perfectly mimic the soulful sound of a pedal steel. This invention was a metaphor for Jim himself, not loud or flashy, but precise, brilliant, and profoundly musical. While Tom Paul led the rebellion, Jim quietly engineered one of its signature sounds. With its doors never locked, Hillbilly Central became the epicenter of the outlaw movement. It was a chaotic clubhouse where the only rule was creativity. The financial freedom, largely secured by the massive royalties from their writer John Hartford's hit Gentle on My Mind, allowed them to welcome any artist battling the Nashville system. Most notably, Waylon Jennings used the studio as his fortress to win creative control from his label, recording his landmark 1973 album, Honky Tonk Heroes, within its walls. The Glazers were the essential facilitators of this musical revolution, with Jim serving as a steady technical hand in the creative storm. However, the very elements that made Hillbilly Central a paradise, the unchecked freedom, the constant partying, and the river of money, also created an unstable environment. The lines between business and brotherhood blurred, and arguments over control and finances began to supplant the music. The perfect, chaotic utopia the brothers had built was now fostering the paranoia and resentment that would ultimately tear their family and their empire apart. For a time, Hillbilly Central was a utopian dream made real, a chaotic, brilliant convergence of art and commerce where legends were born and history was made. The Glaser brothers, in their distinct roles, presided over a musical revolution, their influence extending far beyond their own records. But the creative fire that made their studio a beacon of freedom also burned with a dangerous intensity. The lack of rules, the river of money, and the immense pressures of their success began to erode the very foundation of their brotherhood. The same walls that fostered artistic liberation soon became a pressure cooker for a lifetime of family resentments, turning their greatest triumph into the stage for their most profound and public tragedy. As the 1970s dawned, the Glaser brothers' influence radiated from their studio, Hillbilly Central, the very heart of the outlaw movement. They had built an empire on artistic freedom, with Chuck as the business mind, Tom Paul the creative visionary, and Jim the master craftsman. But within the walls of their revolutionary success, a bitter family conflict was brewing. The studio's chaotic open-door environment, once a creative asset, became a source of contention. The core of the dispute was a clash between Tom Paul's artistic recklessness and Chuck's pragmatic business sense. As profits from their publishing company soared, so did the tension over how the money was being spent. Tom Paul, embracing his role as the patron of the outlaws, operated with little regard for budgets, while Chuck sought to manage their fortune for long-term stability. It was a power struggle layered with a lifetime of brotherly rivalry. Caught in the crossfire was Jim, the lifelong mediator. He found himself in an impossible position, torn between his two older brothers, opposing demands for loyalty. His attempts to broker peace failed as arguments escalated into vicious, screaming matches. The studio, once a source of pride, became a place of anxiety. As Jim poignantly recalled, we had a sound that nobody else had, but we had a problem that nobody else had either. We were brothers. The year 1973 marked the point of no return. The bond was irreparably broken. The official dissolution of the Glaser brothers was not a quiet separation, but a brutal public explosion that sent shockwaves through Nashville. Lawyers were hired, and the brothers became legal adversaries, carving up the empire they had built together. The sublime harmony was gone, replaced by the cold language of legal disputes. In the aftermath, Tom Paul immediately launched a successful solo career as an outlaw icon, and Chuck remained a powerful publishing executive. Jim, however, was left adrift. His entire identity had been tied to the group, and now he was overshadowed by his siblings' larger-than-life reputations. His initial solo efforts with MGM Records faltered, leaving him with a famous last name, but no clear musical direction. Stripped of the family dynamic, Jim returned to his core strength, songwriting. He had already proven his commercial talent by co-writing the pop hit Woman, Woman, a reminder that his skill was independent of the family name. Now he began channeling the turmoil of the breakup into his music, writing with a new vulnerability. While professionally at a low point, he was unknowingly laying the foundation for a remarkable comeback, beginning the slow process of rebuilding his career, one song at a time. The explosion was final, the fallout absolute. When the dust settled on the wreckage of the Glaser Brothers' empire, Jim was left standing alone, his professional and personal identity shattered. The end of the band was not merely the end of a career. It was the loss of his family and the erasure of a life he had known since childhood. To rise from such ashes required more than just talent. It required a deep reservoir of fortitude and an unshakable belief in his own voice, separate from the harmonies that had once defined him. The decade that followed would be a testament to that resolve. A long, often discouraging, and ultimately triumphant journey to rebuild his life and career, proving that the quietest voice can sometimes echo the loudest. The years following the 1973 implosion of the Glaser Brothers partnership were a long and often lonely road for Jim Glaser. He was a man in his late 30s, a seasoned veteran of the music industry, yet in many ways, he was starting over from scratch. The Nashville that had once celebrated him as part of a famous trio now seemed unsure of where to place him. The music scene itself was in a state of flux. The raw, rebellious energy of the outlaw movement, which his family had been so instrumental in fostering, had peaked and was already being co-opted and commercialized by the mainstream. As the 1970s wore on, country music began to flirt with the slick sounds of pop and disco, culminating in the urban cowboy craze at the decade's end. For an artist like Jim, whose sensibilities were rooted in classic country melody but refined with a sophisticated, almost pop-like smoothness, finding a niche in this changing landscape was a formidable challenge. He continued to work tirelessly, releasing a series of albums and singles for MGM and other labels. Records like his 1977 album The Man in the Mirror were filled with well-crafted songs and his signature smooth vocals, but they struggled to gain traction at radio. He was haunted by his own past. He was too associated with the old guard to be considered new, yet he wasn't rebellious enough to be fully embraced by the lingering outlaw faction. He existed in a professional purgatory, a man with a famous name, but an uncertain future. During this period, there was even a brief and ultimately ill-fated attempt to recapture the old magic. From around 1979 to 1982, the Glaser brothers put their differences aside, or at least suppressed them, for a reunion. They recorded new albums and even scored a top 10 hit with a cover of the Shel Silverstein-penned "Lovin' Her Was Easier Than Anything I'll Ever Do Again." On the surface, it was a comeback. They appeared on television together, their voices blending with the same effortless precision as always. But the harmony was purely musical. The deep-seated personal issues that had torn them apart years earlier had never been resolved. The reunion was more of a business arrangement than a true reconciliation, a temporary truce in a long, cold war. It soon fizzled out, and the brothers once again went their separate ways. For Jim, the experience likely served as a final, definitive confirmation. His future, if he was to have one, could not be found in the past. The only way forward was alone. The dawn of the 1980s brought another shift in the country music winds. A new generation of artists, later dubbed the neo-traditionalists, was emerging, and alongside them was a slicker, more polished country pop sound that dominated the airwaves. This new environment, unexpectedly, was perfectly suited for Jim Glaser. His earnest, clear tenor voice and his gift for writing emotionally direct melodic ballads were back in vogue. After years of struggling, the tide was finally beginning to turn. He signed with Noble Vision Records, a small independent label which made him an underdog in a town run by corporate giants. He didn't have the marketing muscle of a major label behind him, but he had something more important: the right song at the right time. In 1983, he wrote and recorded a ballad of breathtaking simplicity and emotional power. The song was "You're Getting to Me Again." It was a tale of enduring love and inescapable connection, the story of a person who finds themselves still captivated by a former lover. The lyric was heartfelt and universal, and Jim's vocal performance was a masterclass in understated emotion. He sang not with bravado, but with a vulnerable sincerity that was impossible to ignore. The song was released with little fanfare, but it possessed a quiet magic that resonated with listeners. It began a slow, patient, and seemingly unstoppable climb up the Billboard country charts. Week after week, the song gained momentum. Radio programmers, tired of formulaic hits, were drawn to its genuine emotion. Listeners called in to request it. It was a true word-of-mouth success story, a testament to the power of a great song to cut through the noise. For Jim, this slow ascent must have been a period of incredible, almost unbearable anticipation. After a full decade of professional frustration, of being defined by his family's drama, of feeling like an afterthought in his own career, he was on the verge of the one thing that had eluded him, a major hit that was entirely his own. In early 1984, the impossible happened. "You're Gettin' to Me Again" reached the coveted #1 spot. James William Glaser, the quiet boy from Spalding, Nebraska, the youngest brother, the forgotten man, had the biggest song in country music. It was a moment of profound, almost poetic vindication. He had reached the summit not by riding on his family's coattails, not by conforming to a trend, but by being authentically himself. He had done it on a small label with a song he wrote from the heart. It was the culmination of a decade of perseverance, a triumph of talent and tenacity over adversity. At 47 years old, an age when many artists are considered past their prime, Jim Glaser had finally, unequivocally, arrived. That #1 hit was not a fluke. It was the beginning of the most successful period of his career. The floodgates opened, and for the next few years, Jim was a consistent presence on the country charts. He followed his chart topper with a string of hits that solidified his place as a star in his own right. He re-recorded "The Man in the Mirror," a song he had written years earlier that had been a hit for Conway Twitty. And this time, his own version became a top 20 success. He scored major hits with the romantic ballad "If I Could Only Dance With You" and the tender "When You're Not a Lady." His sound was perfectly attuned to the era, a smooth, elegant blend of traditional country sentiment and contemporary pop production. It was music for adults, filled with themes of love, loss, and fidelity. During this golden era, he was finally able to step out from the long shadow of his family's legacy. When he gave interviews, the conversation was about his music, his success. The questions about the bitter breakup and the outlaw days, while never disappearing entirely, were no longer the sole focus. He had rewritten his own narrative. He was no longer just one of the Glaser brothers. He was Jim Glaser, the solo star, a man who had faced down professional oblivion and emerged victorious on the other side. As his time in the spotlight eventually faded, as it does for all artists, Jim settled into a well-earned role as a respected elder statesman of country music. The story of the Glaser brothers, in all its triumph and tragedy, became the stuff of Nashville legend. Their legacy is a complex one. As a vocal trio, their intricate harmonies remain a benchmark of excellence. As revolutionaries, their role in creating Hillbilly Central is undeniable. They were the essential architects who built the house where the outlaw movement could be born. Their story also serves as a timeless cautionary tale about the immense danger of mixing family, fame, and finance. It is, as Chuck's book so aptly named it, an American tragedy. But within that larger epic, Jim Glaser's individual legacy shines through as a story of quiet strength and remarkable resilience. He was a hit solo artist who proved that perseverance pays off. He was a world-class songwriter who could craft a pop classic as easily as a country ballad. And he was a brilliant innovator whose Glaser B-bender remains a vital piece of musical hardware, a quiet contribution to the sound of the electric guitar that speaks volumes about his meticulous, inventive mind. In their later years, the brothers did find some measure of peace. They never fully recaptured the closeness of their youth, as some wounds cut too deep to ever completely heal. But they performed together on rare occasions, most poignantly at a reunion show in their hometown of Spalding. These moments were a testament to the fact that the bonds of blood, however strained, never truly break. When Jim Glaser passed away in 2019, he left behind a legacy of profound musicality and inspiring determination. His life was a study in contrast, a journey defined by both beautiful harmony and painful discord. He stood at the center of a musical revolution, helped his family build an empire, and endured the agony of watching it all fall apart. And then, when most would have walked away, he found the quiet courage to pick up the pieces and start again, building a new dream for himself, note by patient note. He may not have been the loudest voice in the room or the wildest spirit, but his was the voice that endured. Jim Glaser's story is a powerful reminder that sometimes the most meaningful victories are the quiet ones, and that the most important voice a person can ever find is, finally, their own, without hesitation if a line was lazy or a story wasn't working. He trusted her judgment implicitly. Over time, they began writing together as equals, their individual styles merging into a singular, powerful voice. While Hall's solo career continued through the 1970s, the duo quietly turned their focus toward their shared passion, bluegrass music. It was a return to the roots for Hall, the music of his Kentucky childhood. Together, Tom T. and Dixie Hall became the most dominant songwriting team in modern bluegrass history. They penned an astonishing number of hits, by some counts over 500 published songs, including dozens of number ones on the bluegrass charts for legends of the genre like Ralph Stanley, the Osborne Brothers, and Del McCoury. Their songs were celebrated for their adherence to traditional bluegrass themes: faith, family, hardship, and home, while infusing them with the sharp narrative detail and psychological depth that was Hall's trademark. Fox Hollow became a pilgrimage site for bluegrass artists, a place where they could find not only a perfectly crafted song, but also a warm meal and genuine fellowship. The farm was not a fortress to keep the world out, but a welcoming haven where the craft of songwriting was nurtured and celebrated. This idyllic life, filled with love, animals, and the constant joyful work of creating music, was the bedrock of Hall's existence for nearly 40 years. As the 1970s gave way to the 1980s, the landscape of mainstream country music began to shift dramatically. The thoughtful, folk-inflected singer-songwriter era that Hall had helped define was supplanted by the slick, pop-infused sounds of the urban cowboy movement. The charts were soon dominated by polished productions, synthesizers, and artists whose sound owed more to Los Angeles pop than to Appalachian folk. Once again, Hall's music was out of step with the times. His radio hits dwindled, and the pressure to adapt to chase the new trend was immense. But Hall refused. He had built his entire career on a foundation of unshakable authenticity, and he had no interest in abandoning it for a fleeting moment of renewed chart relevance. He accepted this changing of the guard with his characteristic grace and lack of ego. He saw it not as a rejection, but as a natural evolution. With his commercial pressures lessened, He simply turned his storytelling talents to new mediums. In 1979, he published his memoir, The Storyteller's Nashville, a book still regarded as one of the most honest and insightful accounts ever written about the inner workings of the music industry. He followed it with a successful novel in 1982, The Laughing Man of Woodmont Coves, proving his narrative gifts were not confined to the 3-minute song. He wrote a textbook on songwriting, How I Write Songs, Why You Can, sharing the secrets of his craft with a new generation. He even found a devoted following as a children's author. He had gracefully transitioned from a performing star to an elder statesman, his identity as the storyteller now broader and more profound than ever. He continued to tour sporadically, playing for loyal audiences who still cherished his brand of quiet wisdom, but his focus had shifted from the stage to the serene creative world he and Dixie had built at Fox Hollow. This long, peaceful, and creatively fertile autumn of his life was, however, destined for a harsh and unforgiving winter. In the early 2000s, the unwavering center of his world, his beloved Miss Dixie, began to decline in health. The specific details of her illness were kept private, but it was a long and difficult battle that slowly eroded the vibrant life they had built together. The man who had spent his life observing the world from a distance now found himself in the trenches of full-time caregiving. The focus of his days shifted from crafting lyrics to managing medications, from recording sessions to doctor's appointments. The songwriter gatherings ceased, and a quiet stillness began to settle over Fox Hollow Farm. The vibrant sanctuary became a private hospital, its master now devoted to a single desperate cause, caring for the woman who had been his partner in everything for nearly half a century. Iris Dixie Hall died on January 16, 2015. For Tom T. Hall, her loss was not just a heartbreak, it was an amputation. He had lost his wife, his creative partner, his muse, his editor, his business manager, and his best friend all at once. The silence she left behind in the rooms of Fox Hollow was, by all accounts, a deafening and unbearable thing. Friends and family who saw him in the years that followed described a man utterly adrift, a ghost haunting the monument to a life that no longer existed. He became increasingly reclusive, the once warm and welcoming gates of the farm now often remaining closed. His own health began to fail, compounding his profound grief with chronic physical pain. The man who had written with such clarity and compassion about the sorrows of others was now trapped in a story of his own, a bleak and seemingly endless narrative of loss from which he could find no escape. The storyteller had lost the plot. On the morning of August 20th, 2021, 6 years after Dixie's death, the story reached its final, tragic conclusion. Tom T. Hall, the man who had given voice to the quiet dignity of so many, ended his own life. The act was a brutal coda to a life of gentle wisdom, a final, desperate story told not in words, but in a devastating silence. In the aftermath, the world struggled to reconcile the two conflicting images of Tom T. Hall, the wise, benevolent storyteller and the broken man who died in an act of violent despair. But perhaps the two are not in conflict at all. Perhaps they are two sides of the same exquisitely sensitive coin. The very qualities that made him a transcendent artist, his deep empathy, his acute sensitivity to the pain and beauty of the world, his almost porous to absorb the stories and emotions of others, were the same qualities that left him so profoundly vulnerable to his own sorrow. For decades, his partnership with Dixie had been the vessel that contained his own melancholy, the anchor that kept him steady. When that anchor was gone, he was simply cast adrift on a sea of grief he could no longer navigate. His death does not negate the wisdom of his life's work. It underscores it with a heartbreaking poignancy. It is a final brutal reminder that even the wisest among us are not immune to the crushing weight of the human condition. The legacy Tom T. Hall leaves behind is as vast and as deep as the Kentucky hills that raised him. His most tangible impact is on the craft of songwriting itself. He was a foundational figure, a trailblazer who fundamentally expanded the lyrical and thematic possibilities of country music. He kicked down the doors for a new generation of artists who valued literary depth and narrative realism. Without Tom T. Hall, it is hard to imagine the careers of songwriters like Jason Isbell, who chronicles the modern South with a novelist's eye, Sturgill Simpson, who blends Appalachian philosophy with cosmic curiosity, Brandi Carlile, whose songs are portraits of profound empathy, or Tyler Childers, who carries the torch of Kentucky storytelling into the 21st century. They, and countless others, are all his creative children, operating in a landscape that he helped to clear, proving that country music could be and should be a home for serious, intelligent, and compassionate art. But his greater legacy is a moral one. In a world that grows ever louder, faster, and more polarized, Tom T. Hall's body of work stands as a quiet, powerful monument to the forgotten art of listening. His entire career was an act of radical empathy. He taught us that every life has a story, that there is dignity in every honest trade, and that the greatest wisdom is often found not in the halls of power, but in the quiet conversations with the people we overlook every day. He couldn't write a peaceful ending for his own story, but the hundreds of stories he gave to the world remain as a timeless and essential guide. They are tales of old dogs and children and watermelon wine, and of the fragile, beautiful, and heartbreaking search for a little bit of grace in an often ungraceful world. The storyteller is gone, but his stories will live forever.